You just don't do that. But he does. Very bad form. And there's his wife posed as a prostitute on the prodigal's lap. Rembrandt becomes the prodigal son, the epitome of sinful, wayward, rebellious humanity. And then, in contrast, Rembrandt becomes the aristocrat, painted in 1643, now 37 years old, fur, gold chain, fancy beret, bold, penetrating eyes, all the marks of a wealthy, powerful, sober, righteous man, a leader in the city with an impeccable reputation. But there is still that aura of noble melancholy, that vulnerability, that transparency of the person behind the persona. By this time, he had lost 3 children who died in infancy, and by this time, he'd lost the love of his life, his wife Saskia, in the previous year. And I think in this portrait, as elegant as he looks, it reflects the reality of his life, highly regarded by the aristocracy, but his heart is broken by personal tragedy. And the portrait I've seen most often because it's at the Met in New York City. And we're there 3, sometimes 4 times a year. And I make my kind of annual trek to stand in front of this portrait and have my little conversation with Rembrandt and say, Rembrandt, who are you? What are you thinking? What are you saying to me here? What does this self-portrait say to you? Well, I think it shows that he's aged considerably, but it also shows the inner person has grown stronger. By this time, Rembrandt has gone through complete and total bankruptcy. He's been in the court for the last 3-4 years, and by this time, he's been stripped of everything. He's living in a rented house. All of his goods and everything have been taken away. And yet this portrait reveals that through his suffering, he's become a wiser man. This is Rembrandt as the Apostle Paul, painted in 1661. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. He's 55 at this point. In this portrait, Rembrandt identifies himself with the Apostle Paul. But the amazing thing is, if you look at it, Apostle Paul looks somewhat quizzical, like a puzzled look on his face. Remember that the mirror is the instrument for doing a self-portrait. He's looking in a mirror. He looks up from the text, as it were, looks in the mirror. And recall the Apostle Paul's words, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know only in part, then I shall understand fully." This passage may explain Rembrandt's quizzical look. As he scrutinizes his own image in the mirror, he confronts the uncertainty and the limitations of his own understanding. This portrait does not reflect the St. Paul that I would have painted. Not that I'm a painter, but I think of Paul as the formidable thinker who formulated essential Christian doctrine. I think of him as this forceful leader who planted churches all over Asia Minor, Cyprus, Greece, Macedonia, traveled the then-known world. I don't see that in this portrait. In 2 Corinthians, Paul agrees with his critics. He says, "My critics say about me, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account." And Paul says, that's right. But I have learned that in my weakness, God is strong. The Apostle Paul, with whom Rembrandt identified, was that flawed human being who received the gift of God's grace that he did not deserve. And his contemplation of that gift of God's grace continued to amaze him to his dying day. That's what I see here, that sense of amazement. Me? Who, me? The Apostle Paul describes his way of relating to others in a way that sheds light on Rembrandt's self-portraits. In 1 Corinthians, Paul wrote of himself, "Though I am free, I belong to no man. I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak. I have become all things to all men." Which really was Rembrandt's strategy for doing self-portraits. He became like other people. He became them. The beggar, the aristocrat, the prodigal son, the soldier, the disciple in the boat that's just about to sink before Jesus calmed the storm, and on and on and on. Rembrandt becomes this person, that person. And I think that's why Rembrandt's so universally loved. You have a sense of his identification with me, with you, with whoever you are. We live in a day of polarization where people hurl pejorative names at other people. You're a liberal. You're a conservative. What if today I become a liberal, though I'm not a liberal? What if today I become a conservative, though I'm not a conservative? What if I learn, like the Apostle Paul and Rembrandt, to become like the other that is so despised? That's what I learned from this portrait and from his portraits. Well, we come back full circle to this last portrait. He's 63. And here he drops all his pretensions, I think. He was originally holding in his hands brushes and a mahl stick, the tools of his trade, the pride of his profession, but he painted them out. We know this from X-ray studies of this portrait. He originally had a big, tall, fancy hat. He painted it out, put this little small hat on. It's like he just paints out, decides to paint out all of the pretensions and illusions and self-delusions, and wants to express in sheer simplicity and honesty who he is. And that's what he does. His brushwork describes his pitted, thickened face, dabbed impasto, a real thick painting depicts the loose flaps and folds of skin that hang below his eye and his lower cheek. He works diligently, like a makeup artist, to put the features of an old man on his face. But this is not cosmetic cover-up. He's painting the truth. He shows himself with unsparing honesty. Rembrandt discards the masks and the illusions in this final portrait. He looks himself and us directly in the eye with truthfulness and soulfulness. Rembrandt inspires me by his self-portraits, his humility, his grit, his grace, his patient endurance, his strength, his wisdom. You know the story of Jesus having supper at Emmaus. He's walked with these two disciples along the road to Emmaus on the day of his resurrection, the evening of his resurrection. And he is invited by them to be their guest and to come have supper with them. And at the supper table, Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, and breaks it. And the eyes of the disciples are opened, and they recognize who he is. And then he vanishes out of their sight. Now, this painting was done when he was 22 years old, 1628, the time of the very first portrait that we saw. Amazing painting. It is one of the best illustrations of this word I've been using, chiaroscuro. Judy pronounces it anglicized chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro. It's a wonderful term describing what Baroque painting is all about, and Rembrandt learned from these early Italian Baroque painters. And it's this light in the darkness, this contrast of light and darkness, a dramatic impact on us as we look at it. Light coming out of darkness. And that's what we see in this, especially in this first painting